All right, so I think we are going to get started here. Happy Monday morning, everybody. This is always, I always love this time slot at 9:30 on Monday because, nothing better than starting a week with some Torah learning. I wanted to thank Rabbi Marsha Tulchin for inviting me again. I know she can't be here today, but she will probably watch this recording in a couple of hours. So thank you so much, Reb Marsha, for everything you do at the Jewish Collaborative. So we had this idea for a three-part series on Jewish identity, and when people ask me what the Jewish question that I spend the most time thinking about and concerned about, both in terms of philosophy and also in terms of Jewish sociology, and we can unpack that in a minute, it is this question of what makes somebody Jewish or who is included within the Jewish community and what happens when somebody is in sort of a limbo or a gray area where, from some point of view, in some denominations and some groups and maybe some entities in the state of Israel, they're considered Jewish and others they are considered not Jewish. And so I had this idea for this three-part series. Today, I want to really talk about both the ancient and medieval world. And then the last two classes, both next Monday and the Monday after, we're going to talk about how that affects people in the contemporary. And, whenever I say contemporary Judaism, I mean the last 300 years. What has that debate ended up? So today is going to be much more, biblical and Talmudic. And then starting next week, we will talk about modern period. And then the last class, we'll talk about both issues within Israel and then also issues within the American Jewish community. So that's a little bit of a, conceptual overview. And I am sure by the end, one of the things that I always say, but this class I think is going to be even more, than normal is if you came here expecting a bunch of answers, you're probably in the wrong Zoom call. I had a rabbi in college who oftentimes said, in your life, you're going to meet two different types of educators. One person who's sitting at one corner and saying, come to me, I can give you all the answers. And then somebody else in the other corner saying, come to me, I can give you all the questions. And he said, you should always be very skeptical of the person saying, come to me, I can give you all the answers, because that is not what a real educator does. And so the goal, to a large extent, is I want to paint a framework, and just like a lot of good Jewish questions, I want to sort of create these two poles of Jewish thought, and I'll sort of summarize everything we're going to do today right now, because the material is going to be a little bit dense, but just so we can have a framework to putting things in one category versus the other. Oftentimes, if you were to ask, if I were to take a poll of everybody listening here and I were to ask, how do you define Judaism or Jewish identity? Probably someone would say ethno-religion, right? Hinting to the fact that Judaism has some components of a religion, right? A religion vaguely defined as a group of people who have some set of beliefs that share, ritual practice based off of those beliefs, right? Religion. And other people might say, well, Judaism also has ethnic components, right? If your parents are Jewish, you're Jewish, right? We all know people who are non-religious Jews, right? That is certainly a category that somebody can be in. And so the two poles that I want to start with is this idea that we've always had this tension within Judaism from the outset, from our original sources, of one side that wants to make Judaism more ethnic-like, and I'll define that in a few minutes, and one side that wants to make Judaism more religious-like. And these two sides have been intellectually duking it out for about 3,000 years, right? So this is the ancient framework that I want to paint. And just to start off, I'll give two of the probably most famous verses from the Torah, just so we can even start to see how this tension arises within the Torah, right? We all know the beginning of Parsha Lech Lecha, Genesis 12. This is probably one of the most often cited sources in the Torah. The Lord comes to Abram, go from your country and your kindred to your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, right? The great promise that God makes to Abraham is if you do this, right, you commit, you leave your house in Ur and you travel to the land of Canaan, aka the land of Israel, you are going to be a great nation. Again, the implication is your descendants, right? The promise goes on, and to say, we all know your offspring will be as vast as the stars in the sky and the sand in the desert. And so the promise that God makes to Abraham is if you do this, you and your descendants and your children and children's children will be my people, right? Ethnic model of Jewishness. A couple of chapters later, right, we roll the Torah scroll, you can imagine, and then we get to the book of Exodus. And Exodus, God tells Moses the almost exact opposite thing, right? Moses goes up to the Lord called him from the mountain saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be a treasured possession out of all people, right? The important word here, I'll bold it here, if, right? The promise that Moses and God makes with the Jewish people on Mount Sinai is one that we might call covenantal, right? There is a prerequisite here, right? If you obey, right? If you carry out these religious principles, these ideas, these ethics, these beliefs, then you shall be a treasured people, right? Then you are able to be considered in the Jewish community and you'll get all the blessings that we were talking about before. But then Exodus goes on to say, but if not, God is going to essentially, turn his back on you. So even this tension from probably our original text, you can kind of see this a little bit of tension. Are the Israelites in the Torah and in the rest of the Tanakh, are they people who simply are the ethnic descendants of Abraham? And so we obviously know the story, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob splinters into the 12 tribes. We know that identity in ancient Israel was mostly tribal. And so unlike today, where we don't really have this idea of Jewish tribes except for somebody being a Levite or a Kohen, if you were to pop into a time machine and go to the 7th century BCE, I might introduce myself and, hi, my name is Daniel. I'm from the tribe of Levi. And somebody else might say, hi, my name is David. I'm from the tribe of, Dan or Naphtali or something like that. And so one model of ancient Jewish identity, and we'll go into this a little bit later on in the Tanakh, is primarily ethnic and tribal, right? You are part of the tribe in which your parents are from, right? Almost always the dad, right? One of the interesting things we'll tease out probably next class is in ancient Israel, this was almost always patrilineal. And how do we know that it was almost always patrilineal? Because you open up the Tanakh and people from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, then later on, King David, King Solomon, right? All of the greats, they all married wives who were non-Israelite. And there's no assumption whatsoever that these women converted, and their kids are, of course, considered Jewish, right? Probably the most radical instance of this is Joseph when he's in Egypt, right? He becomes the vice king of Egypt. And then it says, he took a nice Egyptian wife for himself, a woman named Osnat, and they had kids, Manasseh and Ephraim. And again, they were just, the assumption was, of course, they're Israelite. Everything follows the father. So this is one model in ancient Israel, which was of course, if you are an ethnic descendant, right, from the male line of Abraham through the different tribal identities, that was enough to be included within this wider Israelite population. And we'll see the most radical formulation. We'll do 2 more sources and then we'll pause for some questions here. Like I promised, I said, I gave the framework and then I wanted to quickly dive into the sources here because I'm sure we can get, lost in conversation about the contemporary offshoots of this problem. But I really do want to save that for the other classes. Today, I just want to paint a conceptual framework. Probably the most interesting text that we have in the Tanakh that talks about this, that starts off one side of these 2 poles, appears in the book of Ezra. Ezra is not one of the books of the Tanakh that is very often cited. There's no time during the Jewish calendar that we read the book of Ezra, right? So we never read it in synagogue. But there it is, at the very end of the Tanakh, right? One of the last books. And the book of Ezra, just to give you a 10-second summary, the Babylonian Empire destroyed the first temple in the year 586 BCE. Jews were exiled to Babylonia, to Babel. 70 years later, the Persian Empire takes over, and a king named King Cyrus allows the Israelites, by then they were called Jews, right, because it was mostly the tribe of Judah who were exiled, right? This is when the shift from Israelite to Jews happened. And so King Cyrus allows the Jews, the people who were part of the tribe of Judah, to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. And now something really interesting happens, right? If I'm not careful, we can go on an entire tangent in this direction, but I'll say it and then very quickly undo the tangent. The potential tangent is the vast majority of Jews don't actually want to go back to Jerusalem when King Cyrus allows them to go back, right? So there is a whole interesting conversation to have there about the relationship between Israel and diaspora and what happens when you have a Jewish community that's split in half between Israel and the diaspora, aka our situation now. But about 30 to 40%, let's just give a number, of Jews decide, yes, we are going to go back to Jerusalem. We do want to rebuild the temple. But there was a problem because over the 70 years of living in Babylonia, right, this is maybe 2 to 3 generations, a whole host of information and ideas and commitment to Jewish identity was lost, right? Which kind of seems obvious, right? If you imagine the situation before the destruction of the temple, all of Jewish life revolved around the temple. Jews had a king. Jews had a high priest. And so all of a sudden, the temple's destroyed by the Babylonian Empire in the year 586. Jews are thrown into Babylonia, right? If anybody here has read the Psalm on the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept. How can we praise God in our foreign land, right? This is all about this moment of Jews saying, how can we still be Jewish in Babel, in Babylonia? Our Jewish identity revolves around the temple in Jerusalem and the high priest and having a king and having prophets and all of this thing. And so by the time the Jews get back to Jerusalem, there's a whole host of information that's lost. And there's this one, very stunning, we don't have time for this text, but in the book of Nehemiah, which is oftentimes the book of Ezra and Nehemiah at one time was one book, and it was only in certain traditions where it split. So oftentimes it's referred to as Ezra and Nehemiah. In the 10th chapter of the book of Nehemiah, the people gather to celebrate a holiday. They're not really sure what the rules of the holiday are. And so the people start to cry because they say, well, we remember, they open up their calendars and they say, we remember today was supposed to be a holiday, but we don't remember what it was and what the rules are. And then Ezra shows up and he says, guys, today is a day called Rosh Hashanah. It's a holy day. And the people start to cry and they say, oh my God, Rosh Hashanah, this seems really important. What are we supposed to do? And Ezra essentially tells them, go home, bathe yourself, set up festive meals. And so the people don't even remember what Rosh Hashanah was coming back from the Babylonian exile. And one of the things that Ezra does after he has this public reading from the Torah, right? The entire book of Ezra revolves around Ezra having this public reading of the Torah in front of the people, is Ezra then takes a stand. And this is one of the harshest stands in ancient Judaism, against what he considers to be intermarriage. Now, I'll say a couple, two things before we go on. One of the goals here, at least in the next, 45 minutes, is to again present two poles of Jewish thought. One, the dominant, Judaism as a religion pole, the other, Judaism as ethnic poles. And I can promise you, regardless of where one sits on questions of Jewish identity and Jewishness, there are going to be sources that are going to make you feel uncomfortable over the next 45 minutes. And I think this is a good thing because I think it'll allow us to have a more honest conversation next week and the week after when talking about the ways that different contemporary groups in the Jewish community view these sources in their understanding of, what makes somebody a Jew and Jewish identity. The second thing is, this seems like the first time in Jewish history where you have somebody talking about Jewish identity in this way. So I'm going to read the source, and then we can unpack it together. So Ezra has just read the Torah in front of the Jewish people. And here's what happens. When this was over, the officers approached me being Ezra, saying, the people of Israel and the priests and Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the land whose abhorrent practices are like those of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. They have taken their daughters as wives for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed has become intermingled with the people of the land. And it is the officers and prefects who have taken the lead in this trespass. When I heard this, I rent my garment and robe, I tore hair out of my head and beard, and I sat desolate. Around me gathered all who were concerned over the words of the God of Israel because of the returning exiles' trespass, while I sat desolate until the evening offering. At the time of the evening offering, I ended my self-affliction, still in my torn garment and robe. I got down on my knees and spread out my hands to the Lord my God and said, "Oh my God, I am too ashamed and mortified to lift my face to you, O God, for our iniquities are overwhelming, and our guilt has grown high as heaven. From the time our fathers to the very day we have been deep in guilt. Because of our iniquities, we, our kings and our priests, have been handed over to foreign kings, to the sword, to captivity, to pillage, and to humiliation, as is now the case. But now, for a short while, there has been a reprieve from the Lord our God, who has granted us a surviving remnant and given us a stake in his holy place. Our God has restored the luster to our eyes and furnished us with a little sustenance in our bondage." Just to summarize, and then I'll skip to the end here. Ezra finishes reading the Torah in front of the Jews who decide to come back to Jerusalem, and he's looking around, and exactly what you would expect happened. In other words, the Jews had been outside of Jerusalem for 70 years. For the first time in Jewish history, Jews were minority somewhere, right? Ever since Egypt, Jews haven't really been a minority, right? They wandered through the desert. They were mostly Israelites. They entered the land of Israel. Jews were engaged mostly in Israelite communities. All of a sudden, during the Babylonian exile, you have this interaction where Jews are interacting with non-Jewish women. And what do you know? When Jews interact with non-Jews, you have a very high rate of Jews saying, hey, non-Jews, pretty cool. They're just like us, right? Why don't we get married? And Ezra, who's coming back from Israel, coming back to the land of Israel, is looking at this and he's saying, this is terrible, right? This must be the reason why the temple was actually destroyed in the first place, right? Because of our iniquities, right? Just to read this again, we, our kings and our priests, have been handed over to foreign kings, to the sword, to captivity, to pillage, and to humiliation. And he goes on and on and on, right? I'm just going to, scroll through. And at the end, he says, let's make a new pact, right? A new Jewish pact. Now then, do not give your daughters in marriage to their sons, or let their daughters marry your sons. Do nothing for their well-being or advantage. Then you will be strong and enjoy the bounty of the land and bequeath it to your children to ever. And he goes on and continues and he cries a bit. And then all of the Israelites, right, just to read this verse, all the Israelites gathered around him, men, women, and children. The people were weeping bitterly. So everybody is crying. You can imagine this, situation in the middle of one of the hills in Jerusalem, and Ezra's, reprimanding the people for intermarrying, and all the people are starting to cry, and then different families get up, right? I'll just read one. I cut out some of the text, but Shechaniah, son of the Jehiel family of Elam, spoke up and said, we have trespassed against our God by bringing into our home foreign women, right? So he says, it's my fault, and other people say it's our fault. And so at the very end, they say, right, I'm scrolling, Ezra says, you have trespassed by bringing home foreign women, thus aggravating the guilt of Israel. So now make confession to the Lord, God of your fathers, and do his will, and separate yourself from the people of the land and from the foreign women. The entire congregation responded in a loud voice, we must surely do as you say. And then the end of the book of Ezra is a list of people by name. And it said, this family who had married a foreign woman sent her away. This family who had married a foreign woman sent her away. And a list of about 40 or 50 different names. So two things to flag about Ezra, and then we'll take some thoughts, and then I'll give the other side of this poll. Ezra has a phrase here that is quite unique in the Tanakh. This is the only time that this phrase appears, and that is Zera Kodesh, right? Holy seed, right? Or Zera Yisrael, right? The Jewish seed, right? And this is, again, a view of Jewish identity that, again, Ezra obviously did not use the term ethnic, because the term ethnic is a 1800s European word. Ezra was operating in Babylonia and Israel in the Iron Age, or late Iron Age. So he certainly was not saying, I guess Jewish identity must be ethnic. But his model of Jewish identity is that what makes Jews Jews, or what makes Jews part of this community, is being a part of this genetic lineage. Again, he obviously wouldn't have used the term genetic either, but being a part of this lineage of seed dating back to Moses, then dating back before that to Abraham, so much so that any foreign seed, right, any foreign either Jews or non-Jews entering into the Jewish community is going to necessarily defile this holy seed, right? He uses the term, the holy seed has become intermingled with the people of the land, right? There's something bad, according to Ezra, and it degrades the holiness of the Jewish spirit, I'll say, when people outside the Jewish community enter in. And so for Ezra, putting forth this model of Jewish identity is a dominant, what you might call spiritually ethnic, but at the end of the day, this is about an ethnic identity that Ezra puts forth, so much so that there's no talk, right? One of the big, implicit things that this isn't saying is there's no talk about conversion here, right? We have no idea if the woman who came over from Babylonia, did they keep their old religion or did they convert to Judaism, right? Ezra doesn't seem to care about the answer to that question, right? I'll even put the, I'll even put this a little bit more forceful. If you are a Babylonian woman and you decide to marry an Israelite man in modern day Iraq, and then he's saying, well, Ezra said we can go back to Jerusalem and build the temple, and she moves her entire family back to Jerusalem with him, you can probably assume she's committed to Judaism, right? It definitely seems reasonable to assume that all of these foreign women were actually living Jewish lives, right? There's no assumption that they were continuing to say worship idols and do all these things, but nevertheless, Ezra still had this model where he says, no, sorry, you have to, give away your foreign woman and everything there. I'm going to pause for a moment to get to some thoughts or questions. This is probably the strongest and harshest formulation of the Judaism as ethnic identity that really appears anywhere in our ancient tradition. So I figured I would give this to here. We'll take 3 or 4 minutes of questions, and we'll see, obviously the other side here.
Daniel, when
Yes.
did Judaism start using only the mother as you're Jewish?
That is a great question. We will get there in about 10 minutes, but it is certainly after this period, right? So one of the interesting things is that the idea that was dominant within the rabbinic period, so I'll say between the year 0 and 1800, right? That's, roughly the rabbinic period, is that Jewish identity flipped from being patrilineal to matrilineal. As we'll see, it's not as simple as that. Within the Tanakh, people like Ezra weren't happy either way, right? So Ezra wouldn't have said, well, Judaism, patches, because presumably this is a patrilineal descent, but Ezra's still upset, right? So for somebody like Ezra, he's saying, well, ideally both parents are Jewish because then you have the, Jewish seed, is what he calls it. And the rabbis, even when they switched to matrilineal, we'll see a story later in the Talmud, the rabbis were also deeply uncomfortable with this and everything there. But great question. Sylvia, go for it.
Thanks. I think I must have missed this, but what happened? What did anybody think happened to those women that the Jews repudiated after Ezra did all his ranting about intermarriage? And they said, of course, you're right. Go away, go away, go away. Then what happened then? Because did those women have children?
We don't know.
You
The book
don't?
of Ezra ends with just this list, and it's the 10th chapter of Ezra for anybody that wants to do a deeper dive later. It ends with Ezra saying, now we must send away these women, and the people say, okay, yes. And then it literally gives, a list of about 50 people and said, this family sent away this woman, but then we don't really know what happened. And so presumably they left and they went back home. And we don't really know exactly what happened in terms of those women. What we do know, and Sylvia, I don't know if you meant to ask a question that allowed me for this good segue, so thank you. What we do know is that within the Jewish community that now returned in the Second Temple period, this obviously started a big ideologic debate because you could imagine a lot of other people, as I think your question applied there, saying, wait a minute, these women seemed like they were committed to our project here of Judaism, and they seemed like they were interested in becoming Jewish. And this view of Ezra, where Jewish identity is just, this holy seed, and you have to have Jewish parents to, pass on this Jewish identity, this seems counterintuitive to a lot of, wider Jewish, ethics that we've been teaching. And so in order to rebut this view, and this, I'll take your question in 1 second, another text, and actually what scholars think was the text that was written right after the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, about 50 years later during the early Persian period, is a book that I'm going to imagine many people here are more familiar with, which is the book of Ruth. And just to introduce the book of Ruth in a second, the book of Ruth, we're going to read it on Shavuot in a couple of weeks. But the book of Ruth, the setting, right? This is always, whenever I talk to undergrads, I always have to stress the difference between when a book was written and what setting the book is in, right? So the setting of the book of Ruth is back in the period of the Judges, 800 years before this story happened. The authorship of the book of Ruth was almost certainly in the 4th and 5th centuries BCE. We don't know exactly who wrote it, but the book of Ruth is seen by many scholars as a anti-Ezra polemic. In other words, the book of Ruth opens up by introducing us to this family, right? We have Naomi, she has these 2 sons, Machion and Kilion, and it tells us in the beginning of Ruth, they married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth, and they lived for about 10 years, right? And then, right, I'm going to, hopefully people have read the book of Ruth, so I don't, I'll say spoiler alert for people who haven't read the first chapter. Disaster strikes, and both Ruth's and Orpah's husbands pass away. And Orpah decides to go back to her hometown at the urging of Naomi. But Ruth decides that no, she had been living as a Jew for the last 10 years, and she wants to remain Jewish. And there's this very famous, probably the most famous line of Ruth, where Naomi, the mother-in-law, is telling Ruth, like, okay, my son died. I don't have another child for you to marry. And so, now it's time. Go back to Moab, right? Moab is, modern day, parts of modern day Jordan, right? Go back to your hometown, right? There's nothing here for you. And Ruth says, do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you, for wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God shall be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you. And so Ruth makes this stand, right? Ruth is, right? Take a moment to reflect on this polemic within the context of Ezra. You had one subset of Jewish leadership here in the 5th, 4th, 3rd, right? I'm going backwards because this is the BCEs, who are saying any foreign anyone, right, but mostly women, are defiling the Zerah Kodesh, right, the holy seed of the Jewish people, because they're bringing in, right, unholy seed into the Jewish people. Another group, again, we don't know exactly, how these texts were written. That's a question for the ancient historians. We'll probably never know. But this text called Ruth is then produced, where the entire thing revolves around a foreign woman, and not only any foreign woman, by the way, a Moabite woman, right? Why is Moabite important? Because the book of Deuteronomy explicitly warns against Moabite women, right? Just to give a little bit of a digression to the book of Deuteronomy, it says, no Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord. So Deuteronomy explicitly says, not just don't interact with foreign women, specifically don't interact with Moabite women. Why? Because when the Israelites were traveling in the desert, the Moabites refused to give water and food to the Israelites as they were journeying across the desert. You shall not seek their peace nor their prosperity all your days ever. And so the book of Ruth directly contradicts his claim. Now, of course, later rabbinic interpreters would attempt to smooth this over, right? So the famous line in the Talmud, where the Talmud says, well, this text in Deuteronomy is only talking about male Moabites, but female Moabites, they were always eligible to convert. But that certainly is not the historic read of this. The historic read of this is there were actually, what do you know? Not all Jews agreed, right? Even in the 4th or 5th centuries BCE. And there were essentially these two groups and these two views of what made Jewish identity. You had one, the Ezra group, where Jewish identity was, if you are an ethnic descendant, right, generally going by the male line from Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and one of the tribes, and then through Moses, you are Jewish. And if not, if you have any foreign anything, right, maybe you're still part of the community, but you are tainted in some way, right? There's something that is less good about you. The other side is saying, no, actually, the greatest leader we have in Jewish history, right, perhaps is an argument to make for King David, and not just King David, but the entire Davidic line that eventually produces the Messiah. Well, you know who David's great-great-grandmother was? It was this woman, Ruth. And the very end of the book of Ruth in the chapter 4 tells about the lineage of Ruth. And it says Ruth produced X, produced Y, produced Z, who produced King David, right? So the book of Ruth comes on to say, not only are the quote-unquote foreign women who commit themselves to Judaism, not only should they be accepted, these are actually representative of the greatest people we have in Jewish tradition are people who decide to join the Jewish community. Again, this word that has previously not been used at all, and the book of Ruth also doesn't use this term, but I'll use it, right? Converting, right? There's some process you can go through. This is what the book of Ruth is saying. It's one of the reasons why we also read it on Shavuot. There's a process one can go through that shifts one's identity from being foreign or Gentile or non-Jewish to Jewish. And this is a model, right? And this isn't, again, I'm putting words into Ruth's mouth and trying to give contemporary terms. This is a model of Judaism being more similar to what we might consider to be a religion or a group of people that are spiritually or communally invested in a project. And it doesn't matter from the purpose of Ruth that Ruth's great grandparents were all Moabites, right? That's irrelevant. The second Ruth decides to commit to the Jewish people, she is considered Jewish, and not just Jewish, she is considered one of the most important and holiest Jews that we have in our history, so much so that she merits to become the great grandmother of King David. So two models, Ezra, Ruth, and you can imagine, again, we don't really know, right? One of the interesting things about painting a picture of ancient Judaism is we don't really know where the majority of the community sat, right? It's not like we have, Pew Poll was not doing polls in Jerusalem in the 4th century BCE. That would have been very interesting if we had that, but sadly we don't. But we do know that both of these books ended up making it into the Tanakh, right? Which is quite interesting because all it takes is reading both of these books to realize, hey, the message of these two books completely contradicts each other, right? We have two books within the Tanakh that offer diametrically opposed views of Jewish identity, which shows, regardless of what one thinks about, who's right and who's wrong, and maybe 80% of people were on one side and 80% on the other, we know that this was an open question. And we know that this question was not settled in the period of the Tanakh, and that even later attempts to sort of smooth this over weren't successful because this debate ends up continuing throughout the both rabbinic and medieval ages. So I'll pause for a minute for any thoughts or questions, and then we'll dive a little bit into the Talmud.
Rabbi,
Yes.
in the one of the things I remember in the story of Dinah going way back, one of the arguments with Dinah with the brothers killing the whole family of I forgot his name and the tribe.
Yeah, Shlem.
Shlem. One of the things, the argument was that the prince father, the king, one of his arguments when they were trying to get married, his argument was that eventually, if we let the marriage go through, that we will absorb their people. And I always wonder is, when we look at who's a Jew, one of the things I think at that time maybe is they probably were also afraid of being absorbed by other people if they let in certain people. So is that also a problem here? It's just not who is a Jew, but how, as a group, could we get absorbed into another group without us really realizing it?
Yeah, that probably is a concern, and that is a very interesting, I think, story where both sides, it seems like, right? I think that's Genesis 34, and I think both sides are sort of, trying to absorb the other community. It seems like, because, this appears a lot in Deuteronomy, right? In Devarim, where Moshe, continuously is warning against, intermingling with the nations of the land. And the reason for that, it seems like, is Moshe is concerned that people are going to be misled by the practices of the nation and the land. And so you still get this debate, right? There could be an Ezra reading of that situation and a Ruth reading of that situation. In other words, one could say, well, why did Moshe say, when he's talking to the Israelites right before they cross over the Jordan, why did he say stay away from the woman? Is it because of, James, what you said? Is it because of a Ruth type model of saying, well, if Jews start intermingling with people who aren't Jewish, it's only a matter of time between Jews simply cease to be Jewish, right? They convert out of Judaism, they adopt other religions, they begin to worship idols, right? Is that the problem? Or is the problem a more Ezra problem where it doesn't make a difference what any of these people believe, right? Belief is sort of completely irrelevant to this. It matters what people's ethnic or genetic background is, right? Is that the sort of point that matters? And it seems like this was a real tension. And again, you have, plenty of stories, right, within the Tanakh, right? I mean, King Solomon is sort of a big one, right? He had many foreign wives, right? He had, 1,000 wives according to the Tanakh. And later on, he's lambasted for this. And there's different reasons as to, well, why was this wrong? Was it wrong because he should have only married Israelite women? Or was it wrong because he actually might have, allowed idol worship within the kingdom of Israel, right? So you really do have this tension the entire time trying to figure out, the exact contours of Jewish identity. The other thing that I think is interesting and worth mentioning is there's a very important historic reason why this debate only starts when Jews are returning from exile. And that's as follows. If you are at home and you are evolving naturally, right? Let's suggest that from the time of King David till the time of the Babylonian exile, that 300 or 400 years, Judaism was revolved around Jerusalem. There was a temple. There was a Jewish king, right? And obviously things happened. I don't want to, undercut, things were changing or whatever. But if you're in a natural, normal evolutionary process, you oftentimes don't have to sit around and reflect what is the nature of our identity because everything feels very natural to you. All of a sudden, once you go to exile, for the first time in Jewish history, Jews are now a minority within the greater Babylonian Empire. And so, of course, once you start to be a minority, you're going to start to ask, okay, what is the definition of me as a minority, right? This is sort of, this has become the quintessential Jewish question also of modernity, right? I said I would try to stay out of contemporary issues, but one of the biggest questions that Jews faced in the 1800s, right, which seems very similar to this debate in some sense, was Western European countries were having this open debate as to whether or not to grant emancipation to everybody. And so Jews were trying to make the argument. Some Jews said, no, Jews are just a religion. And so because Jews are just a religion, Jews can be just as French or just as German as everybody else. And then other people were saying, no, actually, there's something about Judaism that's more than a religion. Perhaps Judaism really does have, a lot more of ethnic components, right? Both Jews and anti-Semites obviously had that view. Perhaps Jews have more of this, national peoplehood component, right? That was early Zionism. So you had the same answer, but oftentimes you're only really forced to reflect on your identity when you're now a minority. And so once the Jews returned from this Babylonian exile, you can imagine before that, there was no guidance of what do you do, right? Do you go and just start marrying whomever, and can they become a part of the Jewish community? Can they not? And so you get these, two views of Ezra and Ruth. And this really did start this big Jewish question of, okay, what is the nature of Jewish identity? Is the nature of Jewish identity mostly religious with some ethnic, lineage in the background, or is it mostly ethnic with some religiousness in the background there? Cindy, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to say in Torah study, we are, meandering through the prophets. And I do think that during that time and, from the point that the northern kingdom gets destroyed by Assyria, there was a problem with Jews turning away toward idols and other worship and other behaviors because of the influence of other countries. And I think that until the exile, it was just one priest after another railing on them to throw away their little trinkets and their idols. But I think that afterward, and with all the intermarriage, it becomes a real question of how do you stop that and how do you, so I think that the interaction, and it gets more and more of a problem, through the modern age, is intermarriage or interactions going to dilute the practice, or are people just diluting the practice on their own, and you shouldn't blame it on intermarriage? And Ruth is the example that she made the commitment, and that's why they read it at Shavuot, where everybody stood on the mountain and accepted Judaism. And in many ways, being Jewish is if you're talking about it as a religion, is a choice of every person in every generation. And so
yeah, 100%. And I love it. You connected it all the way back, right? I'll give you motion sickness for a second, right? It's not a mistake that in Jewish tradition, we've connected the story of Ruth to this quintessentially religious moment in Jewish history on Mount Sinai, right? And right, we don't talk about Abraham much in the context of Ruth because, right, that does represent a different pole of the Jewish experience. Riyadh, did you have a comment?
Yeah, usually when you decide whether it's patrilineal or matrilineal, it has to do with property. And the daughters of Zelophehad is an illustration, so that it would make sense while the Jews were in the land, that the whole development of patrilineal is that the tribes maintain control over their land, and by marrying out of the tribe, that you break up the land. But once they were exiled, then it changes the need. So you get the story of Ruth, you get these other considerations. And I think that makes more sense. Rather than a religious isolation, it's really about property.
Interesting. Yeah, and I like how you quoted, right, because it became a problem just to for people not familiar with the daughters of Zelophehad, right? This is a story of a father who only had 5 daughters, and then he passes away, and there's this question of who gets to inherit the land, and before that, it was only, passed on through the male line, and so, but they were they were unmarried, and so there was this question of, okay, do they get the property? Do they, what happens with this? And it started this, big debate within the, wandering period. But yeah, I think essentially that also keeps on the same tension. I mean, just in last week's Torah portion, again, there's so many different, texts here that talk about this. At the very end of last week's Torah portion, there's a story that, oftentimes is very smoothed over, but it's a story of somebody who goes out and curses God. And if you read the story of what happens, it says, a man whose father was Egyptian and mother was Israelite got into an argument with somebody whose both parents were Israelite, and the man whose father was Egyptian and mother was an Israelite went out and cursed God. And then they end up putting him in jail, and it ends up being a whole thing. But many of the commentators, the Talmud and the medieval commentators say, well, what was their fight about? And the answer that the Talmud gives, it's a fascinating answer, was that this man who was whose mother was Israelite and father was Egyptian, he started to set up his camp, right, in the desert, according to his mom's tribal group. And they said to him, you have no space here, right? Because the tribes go patrilineally. And so, sorry, you need to find somewhere else to camp out. And none of the other tribes would let him in. And so he got so upset that he ended up cursing God, right? And so the rabbis in the Talmud essentially use this story to indict people who are so unwelcoming that they look at this person who, again, this person decided to leave Egypt, right? I mean, this is the important part of the story, right? He decided to leave Egypt with the Israelites, thereby saying, hey, I'm an Israelite. And he was still, at least from some people in the community, shunned out of the community. And so there constantly was this tension, and is this tension within Jewish sources and Jewish community of people who have the view of, let's say, a much more closed off boundary between Jews and non-Jews, and people who have much more of a porous boundary, right? The model of Ruth is much more porous, right? And, as many later rabbis commented on, I mean, the most stunning thing of the book of Ruth is just how easy the conversion process was. I mean, there's endless, things written in the last 200 years about, the conversion process being difficult, and then very difficult, and then extremely difficult, and, all the different things. Ruth, it seems quite simple, right? She express commitment, and that's great. Okay. That's the important thing. And so you really get this this tension here as well. And this continued into the rabbinic period. So I want to do, just a couple more sources, because this is a source that's a little shocking. So brace yourself, right? This is descriptive, not normative, as I like to say. But I think someone asked before, I think Shirley asked before, when did this switch from being patrilineal to matrilineal? And the honest answer is nobody knows, right? The rabbis in the Mishnah just assume it's always been matrilineal, right? There's no explicit Mishnah where they say, here's why we're changing it. There's different theories. Probably the theory that makes the most sense is when Jerusalem was destroyed a second time by the Romans, and Jews were going into the exile that, after the Roman destruction of the temple, there had to be a way to ensure that somebody was the offspring of somebody Jewish, right? And obviously you can't ensure that with the father, you could only ensure that with the mother. And so at some point, some flip happened, but there was still a lot of tension around this. And it's interesting because this is a source in the Talmud that I can imagine a same conversation happening in a Jewish community in 2025. And so it's a stunning case, but let's just dive into it, and then we'll finish with a couple other sources, and then hopefully that we'll have our framework set for contemporary conversations next week. So in the Talmud in Yevamot is a tractate of Talmud that deals with the laws of offspring and the laws of marriage and the laws of identity. And so Rabba Bar Chana said, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, everyone agrees that the child of a Gentile father and a Jewish mother is a mamzer, right? So this is an opinion that goes counter to the way that we tend to view Jewish identity. This is saying Jewish father and Jewish mother, sorry, you are in this position called the mamzer. Oftentimes, mamzer is translated as bastard. It's not really a precise translation. A mamzer is more technically the offspring of a forbidden relationship. So it's not that, somebody born to unmarried parents is actually not a mamzer. But this is, so Rabba Bar Chana says that non-Jewish father and Jewish mother, right? I feel like you need charts here, right? Sorry, that child is not considered Jewish, right? They're considered in this category called mamzer, which you don't want to be a mamzer. But now we have a story. Rabbi Acha, governor of the castle, and Rabbi Tanchum bar Rabbi Chia from Kfar Akko redeemed captive woman, right? So now we get the story in the Talmud where we don't really know what the situation was, but there was a situation where a bunch of Jewish women were taken captive and they were then redeemed, right? So there was a kidnapping and the women were redeemed, one of whom had been impregnated by a Gentile, right? So you can imagine the story. I mean, sadly, this is not, you don't have to imagine for, too long to imagine what it's like for Jews to be kidnapped and then for them to return. And so this story appears in the Talmud. The women return and one of them is pregnant. They came to Rabbi Ami, who said, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Chanina all say the child of a Gentile father and a Jewish mother is a mamzer, right? So Rabbi Ami says, well, all these rabbis said your future child is going to be a mamzer. Sorry, there's nothing we can do. Then, of course, right, in classic Talmud fashion, said Rabbi Yosef, is it a great trick to mention many names? In other words, are you trying to impress me by giving all the rabbis who agree with your position? I can do it too. Rav and Shmuel in Babel and Rabbi Yeshua bar Levi and bar Kapara in Eretz Yisrael all say the child of a Gentile father and a Jewish mother is kosher, right? Is kasher, right? Totally fine, right? So Rabbi Yosef is pushing back and saying, your list of rabbis doesn't impress me. I can find also another list of rabbis who say this child is going to be perfectly fine. And so then the Talmud continues and says, Rav also ruled permissively. Rav was the head of the great academy, Talmudic academy in Babylonia, right? The leader of his generation. But now we get another story, right? Which adds another layer of complexity to this. A man came to Rav and asked, what is the status of the child of a Gentile father and a Jewish mother, right? The same question. And he said to him, the child is kosher, right? I already told you, the child is fine. He said to him, let me marry your daughter, right? In other words, this guy was the product of a Jewish mother and non-Jewish father and said, okay, if you see me as being kosher, let me marry your daughter. And Rav says, I will not, right? I don't want you to marry my daughter. Said Shimi bar Chia to Rav, as the saying goes. I don't know if anyone's heard the saying before. Camels in media can dance in a tiny space. Here is the space, here is the camel, here is media, and yet no dancing, right? In other words, right, you're talking the talk, but you're not walking the walk. You're saying from your, rabbinic purview that there's nothing wrong with somebody having a non-Jewish father and a Jewish mother, yet you're not actually willing to live that out when it comes to who's able to enter your family. So it goes on, and then Sylvia, I'll take your question in a second. So Rav says back to him, I'll make a space so people can read, even if he were like Joshua ben Nun, right? Joshua, Moses' successor, I would not give him my daughter, right? So Rav says, right, all of a sudden he seems to be switching tones, right? He seems to at one time say, it's fine. And then he seems to be saying, but, I don't really want that person to join my family. And so Shimi bar Chia who's obviously upset by this, says back, if he were like Yoshua ben Nun, someone else would marry him, right? In other words, right, you wouldn't have to worry. In this case, if your daughter doesn't marry this guy, no one will. The son of the Gentile would not leave. Rav looked at him and he died, right? Again, in classic Talmudic hyperbole, probably not literal death, but in some way, Rav shamed him to the extent where the Talmud says this guy died. And then the case continues. Rabbi Yehuda also ruled permissively, but a similar case came before Rabbi Yehuda, and he said, go disappear or marry your own kind, right? And what he means by disappear is not get lost, but go to a new community when nobody knows that your identity is somebody who is what we might call today half Jewish, right? I bring this up, and then I'll take Sylvia's question, because in the Talmudic period, what you get here is two important things, which the second I think is actually more relevant to our conversation today, but they're both relevant. One is, as we were saying before, a shift in the assumption of Jewish identity passing from patrilineal to matrilineal. That happens other places in the Mishnah as well. The second, which is more important, is you now have kind of two different things. You have legal status of somebody as Jewish, and then you have whether or not a Jewish community socially accepts people. And these seem like two different issues. And already here, the Talmud seems to be saying, well, this, let's use a much less offensive example, right? I can say, this cup of water is kosher, and yet if you say, okay, drink it, and I'm like, I don't feel comfortable drinking it for Jewish purposes, that's weird, because if it's kosher, I should be willing to drink it. And so you get this, stigma against people that are born to one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent here, and this continues throughout the Talmud. And I do want to finish with two other sources, but I'll take some questions. Sylvia and then Julian. Go for it.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. It's very interesting because it reminds me of an old Phil Oakes parody. He wrote a song called Love Me, I'm a Liberal. And basically he says, and I applaud all your rights, except don't move next door to me.
Mm.
So basically what he's saying is we're all racist anyway. And this is how it's very easy to read this way.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to read it. I love that. Julian, go for it.
Thank you. I just wondered if there's a way to request the recording and slides.
Yes, I will definitely send out the recording. And I will send this link right now before I forget, if anybody wants to follow along with this.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. Okay, so just to sort of finish off here, we this debate about whether or not someone is quote unquote tainted if they have a bloodline that isn't fully Jewish. This continues into the medieval period, and so I want to go to medieval, and then I'll go back to the Talmud for a second, and then we'll be done in 10 minutes, and then starting next time we can start with modernity here. The biggest debate about Jewish identity in the medieval period was between Moses Maimonides and Judah Halevi, both Sephardic rabbis in the early 1000s, right? So between 1000 and 1150, right, is when both of these sages lived. And Judah Halevi gives a view of Jewish identity that seems straight out of the book of Ezra. And so just to summarize Judah Halevi's project, and then we'll go to Maimonides, and then we'll go to the Talmud for a second. I told you I'm going to dump a lot of material today here on you. Judah Halevi writes this book called the Kuzari, where he sets up a fictional conversation between a king, a rabbi, a priest, and an imam, right? It almost seems like a contemporary joke, but his goal was to be able to tease out why he believed that Judaism was the quote-unquote correct religion, right? I don't want to go into that claim, but what Judah Halevi uses to buttress his claim is that Jews have this unbroken tradition going back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so Judah Halevi gives a definition of Judaism where Jews know that Judaism is correct because of this unbroken tradition, generation to generation to generation. And the king at one point, and this is probably the most stunning line in the entire book, the Kuzari, says, well, wait a minute. This whole point is because this king was trying to figure out if he should convert to Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. And the king says, well, wait, if the definition of Judaism you're giving is you are a part of this people who have this unbroken tradition, how is me, who is the king of the Khazars, right, people in, Europe that have nothing to do with this lineage, am I allowed to join the Jewish people? And Judah Halevi responds as follows, right? The king says, if so, this belief should be confined to yourself. And Judah Halevi says, yes, but any Gentile who joins us unconditionally shares our good fortune without, however, being quite equal to us, right? It's a very stunning formulation. It's somewhat unique in the entirety of medieval Jewish thought, where Judah Halevi is putting forth a model where he's saying, at the end of the day, yes, right, this is post-rabbinic. Yes, of course, we have converts. Of course, we have rules of how somebody can convert into Judaism. Of course, we have people who might be, half Jewish with a non-Jewish father and a Jewish mother. At the end of the day, Judah Halevi is saying there still is something special about Jewish DNA, right? I'll use that term. We can contrast that with the view of Moses Maimonides, who almost had the diametrically opposed view, where for Maimonides, Judaism was all about coming to the correct philosophic beliefs. And one of the things that people probably know about Maimonides, and there's a lot to say about this, and I'm not going to do it justice in the next 2 minutes, is Maimonides codified 13 principles where he thought these are the general principles of Jewish faith, right? And Maimonides writes in many places, if you accept these principles, then essentially you can become Jewish, right? Maimonides' view of conversion was much easier than the view of conversion we have now. And on the flip side, if you reject these principles, according to Maimonides, you might actually cease to be Jewish. So Maimonides puts forth a view of Judaism that's much more religious in nature. It's much easier to become Jewish. And for Maimonides, it seems like there are things that people can do and beliefs people can hold where for all intents and purposes, these people cease to be Jewish. Whereas Judah Halevi is still pushing this idea that no, it's about, the bloodline and Jewish DNA. And yes, we have converts, but we all know, again, according to Judah Halevi, that there's something, a little bit less than ideal about this. And this is reflected back in the Talmud. And I think, one of the goals, at least for this first class, is to paint the picture of when we start talking about modernity, and we'll sort of, switch from talking about traditional Jewish sources to talking a lot more sociological next week, is to show that even in the ancient Jewish community, even in the Tanakh, even in the Talmud, even in the medieval period, there was not unanimity on this, right? There were different Jewish leaders and different Jewish communities who were confused by this question of what makes someone Jewish, what is the role of people joining the Jewish community, what is the role of intermarriage in the Jewish community, all of the questions that we tend to think are 21st century or 20th century questions were going in the Iron Age. They were going in the medieval period in Spain. They were happening in Babylonia during the times of the Talmud. And just to finish off with a couple of sources for the Talmud, where you can see even the Talmud's ambivalence with this and the difference of opinions, you get some very stunning ones, right? You get some of the, strongest worded lines in the Talmud are specifically about this idea of people joining the Jewish community. And so I'll read 4 sources right off the bat, then we'll take a couple minutes for questions. So in one place in the Talmud, Rabbi Chelbo says converts are difficult for the Jewish people like a leprous sore on the skin, right? That's probably not the warm welcome one would want to give somebody who converts to the Jewish people. And then again, in a Talmud Sanhedrin, Rabbi Yochanan says a Gentile who engages in Torah study is liable to receive the death penalty, right? So we can put these two views on the Judaism as very closed boundary positions, right? There are converts, but they are less than ideal. They're like a sore. They're a blemish, right? Using the word of tsarat, right? Something you don't want to have. And then Rabbi Yochanan saying even stronger, right? A non-Jew who, right? There's no way to convert unless you start to learn Torah first, right? Because otherwise, how would you know what you potentially want to convert into? And Rabbi Yochanan is saying, right, this is bad. We don't want this. Juxtapose that with Rabbi Meir, who says a Gentile who engages in Torah study is considered like a high priest. Rabbi Meir has the exact opposite view, right? This is the view of Ruth. Not only can people join the Jewish community and start to learn about Judaism, if they do so, they actually have the ability to be better than your average person who's born Jewish, just like Ruth was the great grandmother of David. Also, a person coming from the outside who starts to learn Torah is akin to the high priest, right? The head of the temple. And then one more source in Talmud Pesachim, this will be the last source for today. Rabbi Elazar said, the Holy One, blessed be he, exiled Israel among the nations only so that converts could join them, right? This is, I think, one of the most interesting texts that we have about exile, of saying the reason why God just allowed Jerusalem to be destroyed, the temple to be destroyed, Judaism to undergo this major historic shift is only because that allows Judaism to become more open and more diverse and to actually allow people into the Jewish community. So we get these opinions that, again, you can either view this as, a binary, but obviously most people probably in the ancient world sat in between these two poles. But this debate that was ongoing and raging that really touches, I think, every facet of what we say today when we talk about Jewish identity. Sydney, go for it. Or Fred.
Actually, it's me, and I think Julian and I came up with the same thoughts at the same time. We were just reading Isaiah, and so much of that says that that there will be, Jerusalem will be a light among the nations, and all the nations will come and will study and learn and be part of God's, bigger plan and bigger, so this sounds completely opposite of what Isaiah's saying.
Yeah, 100%. And arguably the prophets strike a much more universalistic tone compared to, other ancient Jewish texts that strike a much more particularistic tone, right? So you have the famous, right, in the end of Zechariah, right? He has this vision where one day all the nations of the world are going to come to Jerusalem and are going to, worship together. And this is his ideal. And you can juxtapose that with other ideals where it's just the Jewish people at the end of, at the end of the day. So we've sort of always had this tension. And the last thing that I want to suggest is that I think this is actually a good tension to have, right? In other words, I would imagine most people here are sitting there and, very uncomfortable for probably mostly good reason with the Ezra, Judah Halevi position. But I want to give one argument in general defense of having that idea around, not to say we should, fully adopt that as a view, but one of the things that people often know, but they don't really know where it comes from, is that Judaism doesn't proselytize, right? It's, something you hear again and again and again. And what that, and we know both in the terms of, Christianity and Islam and other proselytizing faiths, right? Oftentimes proselytization doesn't just end with, surely come to coffee with me. Let me try to, show you the truth, right? Oftentimes it comes with, conquest and violence and forced conversion and, things that Jews have been subjected to. And because we've had this tension within Judaism, and because we haven't only had the idea that the goal of Judaism is to attract as many people as possible and to profess Judaism as a religion on people, has actually kept Judaism from the same nature of proselytization. And so, there is a very delicate, I think, sociologic balance with all this where, on the one hand, from the point of view of somebody wanting to join the Jewish community, texts like Judah Halevi and Ezra and some of the opinions in the Talmud can seem very off-putting, and they are, right? I don't think we should undersell that. On the other hand, what stopped Judaism historically from actually going out and saying, you should be Jewish, or what's stopping, that historically has also been this view of, well, wait a minute, there is some ethnic component to Judaism, even if we can't really quantify it, and even if we reject Ezra's, sermon about Jewish seed, right? We still all recognize that, there is something to do with ethnicity when it talks about Jewish identity, so that Judaism is not just what we might consider a religion. And I think that's actually been a very helpful balance to have, because to Sydney's point, if Judaism was fully universalistic, then it's very hard to stop from proselytization. And so I think this balance between the universal, in other words, is Judaism for everyone, and the particular, Judaism is just for Jews, I think has been very healthy. Obviously, in contemporary Jewish spaces, if one goes too far in on one of those sides, obviously that can create a lot of trouble. But that's sort of my general framework for thinking about this, where I'm not saying here's the good side, here's the bad side, and they've been arguing about it for 3,000 years. I do think they have been healthy checks on each other, really for the betterment of everyone in the Jewish community. I know we are 8 minutes past, so I wanted to thank everybody. We're going to be back 9:30 next week, and next week's exciting. I'll just give the quick pitch for why you should come back next Monday. We were all talking about this today from the internal perspective. In other words, how do Jews see our own identity? But that's only half the story. The other half of the story is, how did the wider public see Jews, and how did that change Jewish identity? And in recent years, there's been a lot of fascinating research about how the Spanish Inquisition changed Jewish identity really forever. And that talking about Jewish identity, say in the 1300s, pre-Inquisition, was different than talking about Jewish identity in the 1600s. And so we'll talk a little bit about that and how that then led into the modern Jewish period of thinking about whether or not Judaism is an ethnicity, a nation, more nefariously, a race. Where do those ideas come from? And so we'll start with the Inquisition next week, and then we'll go through modernity. And then in 2 Mondays, we'll talk about a lot of the big questions today and, what are some ways to think about it. But have a wonderful rest of your Monday.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Great.